Welcome everybody to CI Can. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of our SDG webinar series that we're very excited to bring to you. My name is Judy Vargatoth, and I'm the Manager of Impact Partnership Services with the Canadian Partnerships Division at Colleges and Institutes Canada. And I will be moderating today's webinar, which will be presented by three exceptional panelists, UNESCO Chair for Sustainability in Higher Education, Charles Hopkins, Tina Cobb, who works as a Senior Policy Advisor in the SDG unit at the federal government, and Beth Eden, who is the SDSN Youth Canada Network Coordinator. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar. We do have over 70 people signed up and registered and in attendance, and we're delighted to have you all with us. We're looking forward to sharing this time with you and having some engaging discussion. You saw a few of the instructions on the slide as you joined us, so please keep your video on mute and your microphone on mute until the end. If you have questions or comments, please add them in the chat box. We will be monitoring that, but we'll be keeping our questions to the very end of the webinar. If you have any technical issues you can't hear or see and you need our assistance, please put it in the chat box as well. We will be recording the webinar and we'll share that recording with all of you so that if you liked what you saw, you can share it with your colleagues and make use of it to spread the good word about the SDGs in our sector. So before I pass it on to our speakers, I'd like to just say a few words about Colleges and Institutes Canada for those of you who are not familiar with us. We are the national and international voice of Canada's publicly supported colleges, institutes, cégeps, and polytechnics. We champion innovation, applied research, international development, employment, and entrepreneurial opportunities that are created by our members and partners in Canada and around the world. Our vision is to create better futures for peoples and communities. As you will see, this aligns well with the SDG vision of no one left behind. And now, more than ever, we continue to embrace our role as advocates, capacity builders, and drivers of knowledge. Our nearly 140 member institutions serve students from all over the country, thanks to more than 670 locations across Canada. In fact, 95% of Canadians and 86% of Indigenous peoples live within 50 kilometers of a college or institute, making colleges and institutes very well positioned to respond to community and industry needs. So on this note, I will pass it over to our first speaker to share their expertise on why the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, matter to the college and institute sector. So to get started, we will have Charles Hopkins, who is the UNESCO Chair in Reorienting Higher Education Towards Sustainability. Charles, thank you for joining us, and I invite you to share your screen and make your presentation.
Right. Thank you very, very much, Judy. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone this afternoon. I was asked to give a sort of a global perspective and a historical context of the SDGs. And so my talk will sort of circle around that particular aspects. It's very difficult to give a historical perspective as to exactly where it all begins, because at the heart of sustainable development, the context of intergenerational responsibility, the idea of carrying capacity, the idea of connectedness of all life and so on is rooted deeply in traditional lifestyles and in indigenous wisdoms. But for most, I think, the idea of sustainable development goes back really to 1992. The lead up to that was in the mid-1980s, we had a tremendous dichotomy going on in the world where 80% of the world's population really wanted development. They could see how the other 20% were living. They wanted development, whereas the 20% living in the North and the West, they were trying to promote environmental stewardship. And so the president of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, was asked by the United Nations to form a committee, travel the world roughly for 2 years, and bring back some kind of a solution. Now, most of you know the solution they came back with was embedded in a book called Our Common Future. The concept of development, yes, but development that was sustainable. And when it was adopted by the United Nations in 1987, they also came up with a 5-year period to develop and negotiate and work with one another to come up with an implementation plan, which was adopted in 1992. That implementation plan was referred to as Agenda 21. There were 40 chapters in it, divvied up amongst social and economic issues, environmental issues. The concept that we really must engage many people who are normally not engaged at the UN. Major groups were referred to, such as women, youth, farmers, indigenous peoples, unions, and so on. And also there was a section in there of means of implementation. How do we move forward? And of course, that is where most of us who are educators and belonging to colleges and universities and so on, we had our own chapter in there, chapter 36, which was addressing education, public awareness, and training. Now, the Agenda 21, though, also had other aspects. The Earth Summit, as it was called, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, had sort of a much larger package. Beyond Agenda 21, there was also the world leaders. It was the largest gathering of world leaders to that point. I believe 174 world leaders were there. And they agreed to a declaration that outlined rights and responsibilities of the countries that did sign into it, which were pretty well all the countries. As well, there was a statement on forest principles. This is where the United Nations framework on climate change, it was launched. And so, we see the COP on climate change. We think of Paris Accord and so on. It had its roots also in 1992. As well, there was a convention on biodiversity. It too has its own council of their committee of the parties, which continues to meet. So there were a number of initiatives that began at trying to come up with a collective way of addressing overall development. But this, I'm saying, is a story beyond its indigenous roots. There was the idea of how do we manage development that began really after the Second World War with the United Nations. UNESCO largely leading in the education aspect, but we also had the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, and so on. So we have those. Then in 1987, as I mentioned, we have Our Common Future. 92, the adoption of Agenda 21, and that ran for about 8 years. But as we were getting ready for the 10-year celebration of Rio, which was held in 2002 in Johannesburg, we also decided that working on these 40 chapters, that they were topics, but they didn't have targets. The countries could report, but they could report sort of willingly. There were no real hard targets for them. And so the next phase of this was brought forward in what we call the Millennium Development Goals that ran from 2000 to 2015. Now, these were targeted, though, at just a few developing countries. The rest of the world, although they continued to report on Agenda 21, the developed world kind of had a bit of a free pass. And so it was realized that we weren't really making that much in the way of progress. And as the Millennium Development Goals began to run out in 2015, we started roughly in 2012 to come up with a replacement. We realized we needed to engage far more people. We wanted to get a bigger vision. it wasn't just for a handful of countries, it should be for all countries. And so we started a campaign that ran from 2012 to 2015. At the heart of it was something called The World We Want. And it was roughly 1 million people from around the world were engaged, 88 national consultations and so on. And this all fed into a massive online suggestions for moving forward. Now, this largely is what led to the Sustainable Development Goals. It also led to realization that the original concept of Rio, which began with blending environment and development, but came out of Rio adding society or social issues into 3 parts, by 2015, we decided that we should add 2 more. One was the concept of peace. And peace not only between nations, but to have real sustainable development. We had peace right down to the individual, living in security and so on. And peace is not from violence, but inner peace and so on. It's kind of a complex. But we also realized that one of the most important parts was that this could not just be something that governments did. This had to open up and form larger partnerships. And again, we are looking at the role of education, public awareness and training. We're looking at the public sector, the private sector, non-government organizations, and so on. So that was a huge step. So the final goal in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, of course, is the whole idea of building partnerships. And I think that's important for us in colleges and universities to understand. And out of that, of course, came this famous slide, which is now probably one of the most important slides everywhere. But as well as agreeing on the 17 development goals, in 2015, the world's finance ministers met in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and pledged the funds to support this. That was a huge difference from Rio, because coming out of Rio with all the expectations in 1992, the world went into a recession. And at that time, the promise of development aid and so on to the South failed and so on. Now what we're hoping is that with the funding pledge, but now we will have to wait and see what is going to happen with COVID and the overspending that we have in the world. So we see just what happens. The other thing that is very different with these 17 goals is that they come with targets. They come with indicators. And so when we look at the education, SDG 4, then we see a whole line. You can't. The slides will be coming to you, and you can have a look. I'm just giving you the concept, though, that countries need to report on what they're doing, and the whole the aspect of education, what we're doing in sustainable development, is going to be there, and countries do need to report. Now, the other concept, however, is that education is not limited to SDG 4, and this is important for colleges and universities. The whole aspect that education, public awareness, and training is essential for the implementation of all the SDGs. This is at the heart of what we're talking about. So the training aspect is so important, plus the overall concept that how do we embed sustainability into small to medium-sized enterprise, into the SMEs? That is a strategy that is emerging from the UN that will be up to our technical and vocational education aspect, as well, of course, in universities, whether it is in health research or even in philosophy, worldviews, and so on, because there's going to need to be some very, very major shifts going on. We see this as sorry, we see this in this slide. Talk about COVID. COVID-19 shows how all of the SDGs are totally interconnected. One of the problems we can run into with colleges and universities is that often our institutions work in silos. We do research, we do teaching, we do community service, but in our own particular aspect. What we need to do is to think that the Sustainable Development Goals, think of them as a blanket, a patchwork quilt blanket, one piece. It may be a bit useful, but it's not until they work in concert and work together that that we actually find it useful. Now, UNESCO is coming out with a new program that in each of these phases, whether it's the Millennium Development Goals, Agenda 21, now the Sustainable Development Goals, there is an education work program at the global level. This one will be rolled out, the first look at it will probably be this summer, and it will be launched next year, and it'll go from now until 2030. At the heart of it, I know, will be the idea of national approaches, and national approaches. And so there would be a role, I believe, for CCAN within that, coming up with a role for higher education. Let me close by saying that this continuum of the Sustainable Development Goals, by 2030, hopefully we will have more vision, a better way of doing things. The whole concept of sustainable development was the best that we could come up with in 1987, that we could get 174 world leaders to agree to. We realize it is certainly not perfect. And part of the role of colleges and universities is both evolution, how to build it better, and also to question it. It is very, very human-centric and so on. So there are other issues with it. How do we move forward? And so there are two main programs that I would like to share with you where you can become involved. One is a new program that is just being launched this month, and it's called Imagining the World to Come. It's from UNESCO. You can find this on the internet. And they are taking visionaries from around the world to put forward ideas as to how we can move forward. And it's very, very interesting that the first kickout will all be by women who have a particular insight into the world that they would like. The second one is called the Futures of Education. This is a program that will go on for a couple of years, and everyone is welcome to enter into it, whether it is as an individual or an institution, an organization, etc., and to give forward your ideas on even the very purpose of education. What should be taught? What is it that everyone should know? So this is important as we blend it into the concept of building back better. So I hope that gives you some idea of that evolutionary context of where the Sustainable Development Goals have come from. They are real, they're needed. It is a global approach, but it's bringing that global approach. How do we build that back into the local? And Canada itself has launched a program, and I'm going to turn it over now to Tina Cobb, who will talk about sort of Canada's approach as we bring it down. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Charles. Tina, we welcome your presentation.
Hi, sure. Let me just set that up. So I will go with this here. Super. So hi, everybody. I'm Tina Cobb. I'm a policy advisor at the Sustainable Development Goals Unit for the Government of Canada. We are actually situated in Employment and Social Development Canada. When the SDG unit was created last October, October 2018 actually, there was some discussion of where it would land, what department, given the scope of the 2030 agenda and the 17 SDGs. But really, given the focus on poverty and on people and on the social aspects of the SDGs, it was decided that the government would host it at ESDC. So that's where it's at. Okay, let me see if I can shimmy these here. Start this. This is my first foray into, here we go. Okay. So the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, Charles mentioned, these are 17 goals that cross the social, environmental, and economic most challenging, pressing issues facing the world today. They range from no poverty, quality education, reducing inequalities, making sure we have clean water to drink, building sustainable cities in the future. It's really about ensuring the well-being of people, planet, and the prosperity of our future generations. So they are quite, they do cross a lot of portfolios and a lot of, on a lot of different issues. And certainly from, as Charles mentioned, it's not just the sole responsibility of governments to implement, but rather a shared responsibility. I think we can all agree that we all have a role to play in building a better future for ourselves and for future generations. So there are 17 goals, there are 169 targets under these, there are 232 indicators, which is amazing that the United Nations and 193 countries could agree to all of these things. It's fabulous. But it can seem really daunting and not sure where, where you fit in this picture and how you can contribute. What the SDGs really do, and what we've seen in the unit over the last year and a bit, is provide a common language across sectors. So with academia, with private sector, with governments, with cities, it provides a common language and a common roadmap to talk about these issues in a way that we can all understand and relate to and come back to. Yeah, so it's sort of born out of the MGDs, but the Sustainable Development Goals are just as relevant in Canada as they are everywhere else in the world. These are a few examples. We have many, but these are some facts where you can really see, although we are a developed nation and we do fare well on many of the SDGs, there is still a lot of work we can do. So, Canadians are still using an average of 259 liters of water a day, which is one of the world's highest averages. Almost 60% of the food we produce in Canada is either lost or wasted, and we are still some of the globe's highest emitters per capita of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's still lots of work that developed countries like Canada can undertake to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. So why are the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda important for colleges, for graduates? Well, I think it's fair. Ooh, how do I go back? There we go. I think it's fair to say that we all want to make a difference and contribute to a better world. And as I mentioned, this is really a roadmap to help us get there. They can help you see the bigger picture when you're making career choices. How can I fit into, how can I fit into part of the solution, helping build a better world? I can say there is strong buy-in and adoption from governments at all levels, not just the federal government, but provinces and municipalities, with businesses at all levels, with civil society, with funders, and with community organizations. So this is important when you're looking for jobs. People are interested in graduates who understand sustainable development across sectors. There's also an emerging transition to a sustainable economy, which holds a lot of promise for economic growth, for innovation and job creation, which as a college student, yeah, I know you're all interested in. I certainly was when I was at college. So this SDG framework can really help identify common interests across different areas as well, which is a really interesting way to look at the SDGs. And this can help drive cross-disciplinary partnerships and collaboration and create innovation. I'll use the example of a net zero home. It takes a lot of different disciplines to build a net zero home. So using the SDGs as a lens to sort of analyze issues across sectors and skill sets is an interesting way to think beyond your own discipline or beyond your own program, and to say, hey, maybe I can bring something to this program and vice versa. And then you're graduating with sort of a more cross-disciplinary mindset, which is very useful moving forward. So the Government of Canada, budget 2018 was really exciting for us. This is where the government announced funding, solid funding for the SDGs over 13 years. There was 49 million to establish the SDG unit, which I talked about, and also to fund some monitoring and reporting by Stats Canada. So Stats Canada has an SDG hub on its website that reports against these targets and indicators that I mentioned. So you can find that. It's called the SDG hub on Stats Canada website. So you can see where we fare data-wise on these goals. And it also announced roughly 60 million for an SDG funding program, which was really exciting for us, which is something that I run at the SDG unit. And this is really to fund projects across Canada that are helping to advance the SDGs. Really at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals is a whole of society approach, and it's underpinned by the principle of leaving no one behind, meaning that these goals really aren't attainable if they're not attained for everybody. So some of the things that the Government of Canada is focusing on, I have them here: leadership, governance, and policy coherence. So making sure that all of our departments, because these do cross so many portfolios, all of our departments are working together to advance this. There's still a big role to play in building awareness and engaging with partners. We're doing some accountability, transparency, and reporting work. That's largely through Stats Canada. And investing in the SDGs. And also our work is really strongly focused on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and making sure we're addressing issues of inequality. Yeah, so this is just a little bit more on the role of the SDG unit. We act as a focal point for the Government of Canada, and we are responsible for raising awareness, coordinating efforts in collaboration with all of our federal family as well. So some of our key accomplishments, I mentioned the funding. We also in July 2018 presented our Canada's first voluntary national review to the United Nations. So this was a stock take on where Canada stands on all 17 goals. It's available online. It's an interesting document. Shows you where it took a humble approach. It showed where we were faring well on what SDGs, and it also highlighted and showed us and departments where more work needed to be done. There was a creation of the unit I've talked about, and then we launched in March of 2019 online and in-person consultations to develop an interim national strategy. So we spent a lot of time talking to academia, talking to private sector, talking to civil society organizations. They helped us do a lot of outreach so that we could better understand what the landscape was in Canada, who's working on SDGs, what issues in the SDGs are most important to different sectors. So we did a lot of consultations to better understand where Canada sat with this agenda. So following those consultations, we also launched our first round of SDG funding program. So it's a grants and contributions program. It was highly successful. We got over 350 grant applications, 350 contribution applications. And I think that was a bit both shocking, exciting, and overwhelming all at once for our team. But really it just goes to show that there's a lot of people thinking about these issues, and it was really fascinating to see in what kind of ways they were looking at the issues. So in June 2019, we launched towards Canada's 2030 Agenda National Strategy. This was informed by those consultations, also available online. In July, we went to the high-level political forum. So the HLPF is it's the mechanism for countries to go to the UN and report on this. It's an annual event. So we always go and you make a country statement. And so that's really what the unit does, is pull together all the information and the narrative for Canada. And we go and tell the world, this is how we're doing on these goals, and these are our ambitions, and these are our shortfalls, and you go and you present it. Yeah, so I think then we went through an election and we came out of that, we finished our funding program, and we've always continued to be talking to our stakeholders, and then COVID happened, and I think right now the SDG unit and the government in general are looking at ways of how, once we get through this crisis, how we can build back better. And I know that we've had this statement from the Government of Canada, from our minister, saying that the SDGs are of heightened importance now, given COVID, particularly as we look at ways to build back. And collectively turn our attention to building back in a way that's inclusive, resilient, and sustainable in Canada. I think the pandemic has shown us where the vulnerable hotspots are, and moving forward, we're going to be thinking about how we can orient the government strategy on the SDGs to really make sure we leave no one behind. And so this is just some information on how to reach us. If you ever do, I always welcome hearing from college students, from anyone really who wants to talk about the 2030 agenda, has questions about how you can get involved, how it can relate to you, how you can leverage, these dialogues and this agenda to help in your career decision making. So anytime you want to talk about the SDGs, I'm always thrilled to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. That was really great. I'd like to ask Beth Eden now to share her presentation, and keep the questions coming. Please feel free to ask them, not just privately, put your questions in the chat box, because the speakers can be answering the questions while another speaker is speaking. So just go ahead and ask your questions directly. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm hoping you can see me okay and everything is clear for you. I will assume that it's all good. My name is Beth. I am the National Youth Network Coordinator for SDSN Canada. And I'll be sharing a bit about more about the actionable piece, what you can do at your colleges, and how do we localize the SDGs. So Charles was brilliant at the start. Thank you so much for really outlining what sustainable development is and how it grew into the SDGs. But I want to take us back to that moment when sustainable development was defined. Sustainable development was defined as a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their needs. So if you really think about this, we need to incorporate future generations in our decision making, because those are the people that are going to feel the effects of what we decide now. And that future generation is you guys listening, and the amazing people that are working in colleges across the country. So some statistics for you. The United Nations Foundation found in 2016 that 40% of the world's population were between the ages of 10 and 24. So if we think about the timing now, plus about 4 years, that really big population is now going into the workforce, also going into education. And so they are really important stakeholders in our decisions. 90% of this population is actually in developing countries. And we are the largest generation of youth in history. So with that, We also hold a lot of responsibility because we are the last generation to be able to implement the SDGs as we're going into the decade of action, 10 years left. So how can we act on the SDGs and the world's most pressing issue, climate change, is a thing I'd like you to think about. So as I was saying, the SDGs are the blueprint for our future, and we're going into the final 10 years. So with that, I want to show you a video that links really well with Tina's point about building back better. We did a campaign for our national conference on the SDGs, Together Ensemble 2020, and we asked youth, what is it that you can do to build back better post-COVID and implement the SDGs in these 10 years we have left? So I'm just going to show you this now, and beware it might be slightly quieter than the other presenters.
In 2015, world governments created 17 Sustainable Development Goals that we can use to build a sustainable future by 2030. We have 10 years left to achieve these goals. That's 10 short years to completely change the way we live, lead our countries, and interact with nature. Change may have come more suddenly than we'd expected with the start of the coronavirus pandemic, but it's this very pandemic that made us realize how urgently change needs to happen. It is youth that will lead the world's recovery post-pandemic. They have the opportunity now to inform how we can build back better. So we asked them, what kind of world do they want to live in by 2030?
By 2030, I want to live in a world where we see major progress on preventing climate change.
Where we see responsible, low-carbon policies and investments that support resilient and sustainable global systems.
I want to live in a world where we are resilient in the face of natural disasters and other emergencies.
Où chacun peut se déplacer de façon simple et sécuritaire dans une ville durable et belle.
I want to live in a world where the planet and people are seen as equal.
Where quality education prepares youth to create livelihoods for themselves and their neighbors, and inspires them to be active citizens.
Where inclusive work is made accessible to all.
Où les gens de différentes communautés peuvent vivre en dignité et en toute sécurité. If we want to see our vision become a reality, we need to make sure that education for sustainable development is incorporated in every learning stream across every discipline.
We need to integrate the principles of sustainability and the SDGs in every strategic plan, from governments, industries, societies, across the world.
We need to change our policies to hold workplaces accountable.
We need to further invest in local and global sustainable development using scientific, technological, and financial resources.
We must create more spaces and opportunities for diverse women to participate and take leadership.
We need to come up with solutions that serve our entire communities
and help to protect vulnerable populations.
Our collective response to the coronavirus crisis teaches us that
it is possible to mobilize huge numbers of people to work together towards a common goal.
Mais surtout, elle nous a appris qu'ensemble, nous pouvons surmonter des montagnes qui nous semblent parfois impossibles.
We can have great impact. Everyone is on the same page and is committed to taking swift action.
Together, we can build back better.
We can build back better.
Ensemble, nous pouvons reconstruire le mieux.
Together, we can build back better.
Together, we can build back better.
So I hope that has inspired you in some way. And hopefully you can still hear me now. I'll get Judy to just come in if there's any problems. So that video always gives me shivers, and I hope it has inspired you. A little bit about what we do at SDSN Canada. So SDSN Canada is part of a global network of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And so we are hosted at the University of Waterloo. And we are part of this global movement to build networks at university, colleges, research centres and knowledge institutions to promote practical solutions to achieve the SDGs and sustainable development. Some of the initiatives that we've put forward over the past year is our Cities Index. I won't be going into detail of this, but this is about localizing the SDGs to cities, so how they can match their strategic plans for the SDGs. They understand their weak points and how they can progress better in their local community. We also have the SDG Students Program, which I will be telling you about in just a moment. We hosted our national SDG gathering, which this video is part of, and we have free YouTube access to all of our other videos of all of the other sessions. So if you are interested in an area of the SDGs, you can look at that. And we held a youth consultation in 2019. That youth consultation showed that 90% of youth said that they were confident that achieving the SDGs would lead to a better future for their generation. And this was conducted with university and college students. Within that, you can see that their top priority is climate change. So that's kind of an area that I've always been personally focusing on, but it's an important thing to push forward. You've also seen that Tina has showed us that that's one of our really big weak points in Canada. And this is our SDG dashboard that the SDG Index, an initiative of SDSN Global, puts out every year. And you can see here in Canada, our weakest points are SDG 12, responsible consumption, and SDG 13, climate action. So I'm not going to get you to answer this question in the chat box, but I do want you to think about how we can help reduce CO2 emissions at your colleges and in Canada in general. So some of our members, we've got some colleges as part of our network of SDSN Canada and also CCAN, so pushing forward those initiatives in their colleges, and you can also join to be a member if that's of interest to you. So this is the initiative that I lead in SDSN Canada. I lead the SDSN Youth Canada Network. So we work on empowering youth globally. That's through education, connecting them to share experiences and collaborate under the SDGs, and supporting them to have the creation and scaling of their innovative ideas. So the SDG Students Program works to transform the world's universities into hubs of learning and engagement. And I don't want you to focus just on the word universities here. I just realized that that was an error. It's research institutions, universities, and colleges. And the way that we do this is through a three steps of transformation, and that's learning, engaging, and then acting. So I'm just going to quickly show you an example. I know my minutes are nearly up. For instance, say Alex is an energy management student at your college, and he's got a great innovative idea and has created something to help the college out. And there's also another student who's a communication student. How can you get them to collaborate under the SDGs? And that's what one of our initiatives, the SDG Students Program, is pushing forward. Here's an example from the University of Waterloo. You can see more online about this, but they've been amplifying current initiatives that are already happening on their campus and trying to connect people under the SDGs. So they did this by mapping 35 clubs and services that were already existent on their campus to the SDGs to help their campus align their goals to the SDGs and get people to understand about their impact. So they ran a national, a campus-wide scavenger hunt, and then a big conference which had many amazing stakeholders and speakers as part of it. You can see here that participants found that it was really, it helped them understand what was happening on campus and helped them to be educated about what they can do to make an impact. And we had engagement from the whole campus. We just hosted a workshop on the SDGs and campus action that's also recorded. And if you would like to know more about how to engage students, you can contact me directly. At this event, we actually had colleges that were part of this. So we had 19 institutions and 40 student leaders, and they learned about how to better integrate the SDGs on their campuses. I'm going to skip the quiz question. So some ideas about how you can take action. Look at the SDGs as a framework or a goal to achieve, and try to contextualize it to what you can do on your own campus. Can you create a climate action plan or work with the office? Can you help with recycling initiatives? You can see here, and Charles mentioned that it's SDG 4 that directly connects to colleges, but I want to just point out that vocational and technical training is mentioned in the 4 targets within SDG 4. So it is shown as a really key skill that we need to implement the SDGs. And there's opportunities with that. Can we incorporate youth in our strategic planning, in our decision making on campuses? Can we create initiatives to progress one SDG or many as they're interconnected? Can we offer opportunities related to their careers and their next steps? And can we share skills with the community, these vocational and technical skills? It's a really big one. And as everyone's mentioned today, collaboration is key. So I've just mentioned a few kind of resources for you to help you out with implementing the SDGs, but please always feel free to get in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all 3 of you for really thoughtful presentations. We're sorry we have such limited time, but I would love to open up the floor for some questions if the speakers don't mind putting on their cameras. And I do have one that I can start with from the chat box. And then after that, of course, if anybody would like to ask their question, you could also, I believe that you can unmute yourself and ask the question, and you can certainly write in the chat box. So a question that came up was, how can each level of government better support individual involvement in relation to these goals? In other words, how can people feel a greater sense of agency or accountability with respect to the indicators and the goals? So any thoughts about that? Maybe Tina could go first, as you are government.
Sure, sure. I think there are a couple of ways. I mean, as I mentioned before, one of the biggest roles, or one of the biggest parts of our mandate at the SDG unit is to build awareness. I think you need to be aware to be interested, or, you know, or to care about an issue. And I think that there still needs to be a lot of awareness building with Canadians on the Sustainable Development Goals, what they are, how people can participate, and sort of demystifying them a little bit, like they're not just for governments. And in fact, many organizations, many individuals, many businesses that we talk to are actually already doing a lot on the Sustainable Development Goals. They just have never thought about it in that way. You know, they're like, oh, but we just do, you know, we just are a food bank and we just do this. So we can't possibly, but that's not necessarily true. That's helping build sustainable communities, and that's helping, like, so they just haven't sort of mapped their work across the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think I would have to say largely it's an education, awareness, and knowledge building role that the federal government can play. I think our SDG funding program is doing a ton of great work in that respect. And I think it's all about, you know, building and forging new partnerships that haven't happened, thinking outside of sort of your own silos. It's really about breaking down silos, and thinking, how can my skill set support this initiative, and vice versa. So I think it's, yeah, I think we've seen a lot of success so far with our SDG funding program. It's really the first foray into it, but just seeing the quality and the type of proposals that we received, I think certainly we were thrilled to be able to fund that. And I think I can see those growing knowledge from those projects as well. So I think I would have to say that from our level, really building awareness and helping to make these partnerships or bring people together. The government has a really strong convening power. We can bring private sector together with civil society organizations and academia. And so really trying to make those partnerships. It really does come down to people at the end of the day. So thanks.
Thank you. Anything to add, Beth or Charles, about how people can feel a sense of agency about these goals?
Well, I could say I think most cities and regions where our colleges and universities are already located, would have programs trying. Cities around the world are really the leaders in this, much more so than our national governments. At the global level, the International Association of Universities is working on the role of higher education and post-secondary education. And on a global level also, the United Nations University has a program called Regional Centers of Expertise in Education for Sustainable Development. Now, I know a number of CCAN members are already involved in building sustainable communities. Fleming, Trent come to mind, University of Regina, and what they call RCEs. These are big collaborative programs that there are 175 of these scattered around the world, and you can find much more information at, if you Google UNU, United Nations University, IAS, Institute for Advanced Studies in Sustainability. Thanks.
Thanks, Charles. Beth, I wonder if you mind, there is another question, so maybe we can scooch to a question for Beth. Now that most institutions will be operating off-site and online, any ideas on how to engage and involve students to keep the SDGs and what they contribute top of mind?
Yeah, for sure. There is lots of different ways that we're kind of like digitalizing our world. And I think we need to keep in mind that youth are pretty up to date with technology. That's me saying that, you know, like there are students that still do not have access to laptops. So I think universities need to support that. But alongside, and colleges, sorry. But alongside to that, I've seen an incredible work from the alliances that I work with that have done a lot of online town halls. So for instance, I saw a president do a town hall like specifically on the SDGs and had 1,600 people contribute. So there is still a way to have engagement. You know, there's the Q&A feature in webinars, so there can be that dialogue. Another kind of way on the kind of the college and the student perspective in a college would be social media. Social media is so big right now. So there's different campaigns and videos that you can put out. And I would say that, you know, just because we're in a phase of COVID does not mean necessarily that we can't stop advocating for things that we feel is right. And I think it's time more than ever that presidents should be listening to students on what they want, as this is directly affecting them. So I hope those are a few ideas.
And there was a follow-up to wonder if there was beyond awareness, and perhaps for all of you, if you're aware of specific programs, activities, or actions that are possible in an online environment beyond awareness raising. I think Beth touched a little bit on it because I think advocacy is important. And if people know that you care about these issues and you're letting them know online, that can help. But any ideas about actions or activities that could take place online for any of the three of you?
I'll just quickly mention one. The SDG Academy, if you look up online, you can take courses, so you can actually put that on your resume, and it would be very complementary to a job. So I recommend looking at SDG Academy, and there's lots of different online courses. I don't know if that completely answered your question, but that is a resource.
I would strongly support political support for leaders at all levels, whether it's universities, you know, and colleges, going to the president, supporting the building a whole institution approach, through to local councillors, provincial and federal, because there's huge decision is going to be made about, do we just get back to the old normal, or are we going to really try and build back better? And politicians have to feel the support that the general public is behind it. So they need that kind of support or pressure, however you want to look at it.
That's great. Thank you very much. Well, we've come to the end of the formal webinar, and we would encourage you, if you still have questions that you haven't asked, please put them in the chat box and we can either answer them on Twitter or we can reach out to the speakers and ask them to give the answers. So I'd like to just thank everyone for listening in. I think this was one of our most well-attended webinars at CICAN in recent history. At one point we had over 80 people signed on, so thank you for joining us. And we invite you to join the next SDG webinar, which will be Thursday, June 18th at 2 p.m. Ontario or Eastern Daylight Time, and it will be called COVID-19, a transformative opportunity to advance the SDGs. So we'll be delving into how is it that we build back better using the SDGs as our North Star, as our map to get to where we want to go. So again, Thursday, June 18th at 2 p.m. We will be sending all of you an invitation to that webinar. We hope you'll join us again, and you will receive the recording for this. And we also have a survey, a little quick 5-question survey we'd like you to answer, just to let us know if there are other topics that you're interested, what you liked about this webinar or didn't like, and also what subjects you would like us to cover off. There are many different things we'd like to share with all of you, so please take a moment to fill out our survey, which will be listed. I think it will be emailed to you, and we will look forward to having you again in June. Thank you very much.